right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to another episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don Pizzette, today with Mr. Ronnie Wong. How's it going, Ronnie?
It is going well today. I am, again, at a loss of a Ghostbusters quote to return back to you.
No? I wasn't sure where you were going. I thought you were going to say that you got in a fist fight with Jay-Z and Beyonce.
Well, that did happen, but but that's not until the court date comes out. I'm not allowed to talk about it.
Gag order?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyhow, so this is part 2 to our kind of introductory or beginning fundamentals or whatever for project management professional. And we left off in the last episode having talked about some of the things that are expected of a project manager and some of the general terminology that's used to describe the project manager skills, as well as the project team and some other associated things. A lot of terminology, right? Real important because that's what we see on the exam. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about how we actually manage the project, right? So we talked about people before. Now let's talk about the project itself, all right? One concept that's really important to understand when you go into a project, you've got a sponsor, the person who comes up with the idea for the project, and you've got a project manager who's responsible for making it happen, right? So, one person dreams up the idea, the other person has to make it happen, right? But that's not it. It doesn't stop there. There are a lot of people and things that influence how that project gets done, or even if that project gets done. And so PMI highlights that as part of the organizational influences. So what are some of the things that influence a project and kind of change how we manage it, right? The way I like to think of it is, what makes my company unique? Every company has something that makes it different than the other guys that are out there. So you'll find that no two companies manage projects exactly the same. We might have the same framework, we might follow the same basic guidelines, but then there's little things that change based on our company, right? There's an energy company here in town that very, very successful, multi-million-dollar business, been around for a while. And I think they're actually in like the hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, they're a very successful organization. And they have a rule that says no policy in the company can be bigger than what fits on a Post-it note. And so whenever they write up a company policy, it has to be able to fit on a Post-it note. If it's got more terminology than that, they don't do it. And they're a very successful company, but that changes the way that they do business, right? Versus, let's say, the United States government, where any policy they write has to be bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica, or they won't do it. And so these are the kinds of things that influence us. So let's take a look at a few of these. The first one that I've got is cultures and styles, right? Every organization has a different type of culture. That energy company I was mentioning, they try and keep a very personable, very simple communication model between all their employees. They want to be treated like a giant family, a family that has, thousands of members, but basically a giant family. That kind of culture means that a rigid, full-on paperwork style, bureaucratic way of managing projects is not really suitable for them. They're a little more of a fly by the seat of their pants kind of organization. You'll see that. Then there's other organizations like governments, military, where they're very, very rigid, right? Just as a matter of fact, when you're in the military, things that you do have life and death consequences in a lot of cases. So there is no, just kind of do just enough to get by. You want to make sure that it's going to withstand the test of time. So different organizations have different cultures and styles for how they do business. And we're seeing that in Silicon Valley a lot, right? That it used to be that if you wanted to be a successful IT company, look at IBM. It was a bunch of people in suits and ties.
Right.
And now you've got a kid who's been sober for 30 minutes and he bangs out a web application that sells it for $2 billion tomorrow. So the companies change, the way we develop things change, and every company is unique.
Well, the project manager, they have to be able to understand this, that it's going to influence them. So even if they come in from the outside, they've got to deal with these particular factors here. Culture is by far one of the biggest influences, and of course you have to actually understand that culture as you move through. If not, that's going to influence your particular project in a way that you don't want it to. So make sure you do pay attention here.
The next thing we've got are communications. How does your team talk, right? Here at IT Pro TV, We are a cubicle company,
Yep.
all right? So we've got our studio, and if any of you ever come by the studio, you're welcome to come in and see. It's not that exciting. But we've got our studio, which makes up a good portion of our building, and then we've got a bunch of cubicles. And so most of the employees can actually hear me talking right now. So when it comes to us communicating and sharing information, we just talk.
Yeah.
You know, we might have to shout over a cubicle wall or whatever, or actually 1 or 2 people are outside of the main room. So you know, you might have to walk a couple of feet or pick up a phone, but everybody's right here. I see every employee every single day, right? That makes communication really easy. What if you are a multinational company? If you have offices all over the world, you don't see every employee every day. You might not see every employee every year. So how do you communicate? By phone, by video conference, right? Those types of communications are less personal and can breed uncertainty in a lot of situations. And so the way that we communicate influences our project. If I can physically see somebody working, I might not need a status update from them every single day. But if they're across the world, if they're in China, I can't see them, I don't necessarily know what they're doing, then maybe I do need a status update every day so I know what's going on, where they're progressing, and so that's an important thing. So we've got to keep that in mind. Communications influence how your project functions.
Yeah. So there's going to be some organizations, again, where the communication is relatively informal, and then some organizations where the communication has to, again, be in a certain manner, again, whether it's by email or whether it's a telephone call every day. But whatever it is, the process may be more formalized in that particular method. So again, you have to fit in that culture as well. Yep.
All right, and then the last thing that we need to highlight is the organization structure. Now, organization structure, I'm going to bring up the PMBOK on this one because they have some really good stuff in here, if I can remember what page it's on. Let's zoom out a bit here. There we go. All right, so in the project management body of knowledge, you'll find a section in there where they talk about organizational structure. All right. Companies can be structured in one of 3 forms. All right, and I know it looks like there's more here, but it's really just 3. Functional, matrix, and projectized. Now, I used that word projectized a few times in the last episode, so now we're going to really see what it means. Well, most companies today are what are called functional companies. You have departments, maybe you have sales, marketing, accounting. Each department has a manager, right? And the departments are made up by what those people do. If I deal with the bookkeeping, I'm in the accounting department. If I am selling things, I'm in the sales department. The sales manager is responsible for all the sales. And that's where authority lays. Those managers then answer to a higher up. That's a very typical structure for an organization today. All right. That structure has been around for hundreds, thousands of years, and it doesn't really allow for project managers. So project managers don't really fit into this model very well, and we'll see a diagram here in just a moment. Projectized, on the other hand, is where project managers are the managers. Right? That there are no functional managers. There might be a sales department, but there's no sales manager. Instead, each salesperson is attached to a different project, and so they answer to a project manager. In this environment, the project managers have all of the authority, and that's not very common. You see it at places like NASA, where everything is a project, but you don't see it at your normal average company. Right? A matrix is where we blend the 2 ideas. We blend functional and projectized together so that we have functional managers with authority and project managers with authority. And you get varying results out of this, but it tries to provide the best of both worlds. It usually creates confusion.
Right.
You know, this is one thing that you'll hear people who've been in the military talk about it a lot. If you have more than one boss, who do you listen to?
Yeah.
Right? It's very confusing for an employee to be in that environment, but that hasn't stopped a lot of people from trying. So let's look at each of these, and I'll just use the diagram straight from the PMBOK. So this is PMI's representation of it. Here's a standard functional organization. Your departments are divided up by their function. Each one has a functional manager, and the functional manager answers to some kind of chief executive, president, CEO, whatever their title is. And if there's a project, there's no project manager in here, right? See, the project manager is not even on the chart. And so in this scenario, the project manager is borrowing people. borrowing somebody from this department, borrowing somebody from this department and from this department, and then they have to coordinate with the functional managers to get those people. Hey, can I have them Tuesday afternoon? Can I have them Monday morning? You know, are they going to be available? The project manager is really at the whim of the functional managers to get things done. It's not a very project supportive environment, but it is the most common environment. So this is where a lot of you guys are going to end up in that in the workplace. All right. In a projectized environment, let me, these are the matrix. Let me jump down to projectized. All right. Projectized is like the same thing, except instead of having departments, I have projects. All right. And so I might have, like, this staffer right here might be an accountant, and this staffer might be an accountant, and this staffer might be an accountant. So each project has an accountant. It's like an accounting department, right? But there's no real department in this model. Each one is assigned to a separate project. And same thing, we might have a lawyer here, a lawyer here, a lawyer here. I don't have a legal department. I just happen to have a lawyer attached to each project. Might even be the same lawyer attached to more than one project, but they work for a project manager, right? The positive here is your project managers have a lot of authority, right? Very easy for them to manage resources. But it doesn't really allow for ongoing operations, right? Day-to-day activities that occur outside of a project, this doesn't really allow for it. Well, if you're somebody like NASA, and you've got a project that is to put, they're looking at that whole colony on Mars thing, right? So that's a project for them. And they've got a project manager, and they've got teams underneath it, and those people work for that project. They don't work on any of the other projects, they just work for that one, all right? On a positive note, everybody knows who they answer to, and everybody's got one goal, the project that they're on. On a negative note, what happens when that project's done? They all get fired, right? It sounds negative, but that is what happens, right? They're all under contract for that project, and when the project is done, literally their contracts end, they're out of a job. Now, that doesn't mean that they're truly fired. They usually just sign on to another project. A new project starts or whatever, and they move on to that. But it does create a little bit of uncertainty for the employees. They're working for this project, and that is their entire job. All right. Now, the hybrids, the matrix or matrices models, they're the ones that kind of blend the solution. All right. So here they're showing a weak matrix. And most companies that are just now implementing project management are going to fall in this weak matrix model. With a weak matrix, we still have a CEO or a chief of some sort. You still have your functional managers. But when someone's assigned to a project, like these three people here are assigned to a project, the project manager is assigned as their pseudo manager, right? So now these employees have to report to two bosses. They have their functional manager they work for most of the time, and they now have a project manager they work for some of the time. And when there's a conflict, the functional manager wins. And so PMI calls this a weak matrix because as a project manager, you get some authority, but not nearly as much as a functional manager, so you have a weak level or a weak matrix. The next one is a balanced matrix, and while it looks good on paper, this is one of the most nightmarish. In a balanced matrix, it's the same model we just saw in a weak matrix. The difference here is the staff is actually assigned to the project manager. So notice I've got the project manager here, the staff gets assigned to them, and so the staff now has two bosses. If I'm this staffer right here, I answer to my functional manager and to my project manager, and not only that, the project manager is in a department with their own functional manager. So now I've got multiple tiers of management. This becomes very challenging. The project manager gets more authority than they had before, but it's at the cost of confusion of the staff. All right. This is called a balance matrix because it's trying to find a balance between project and functional managers. And then lastly, we have a strong matrix. And with a strong matrix, the functional manager that the project managers work for is actually a manager of project managers, right? So this might be the program manager, right? Remember, your program is made up of all the individual projects that you have. So that person's in charge of them, and then staff is getting assigned. Now, staff still has two bosses, but the project managers are being backed up by their manager, which generally will have more authority than for example, the functional managers. So definitely a interesting mix there. But if we go back to this chart here, they kind of break it down where you'll see, like in a projectized environment, the project manager has the highest authority possible, beneath like the CEO. In all of the other models, you'll see it gets to be less and less and less until you have next to no authority whatsoever. And remember, this is the model that most of us are working in. But you'll notice some of the other benefits that we get as far as resource availability and things like that really does become kind of handy. So be aware that the way your company is structured is going to directly influence how you can run your project.
Right.
So that's a big deal. These are definitely something that's going to show up on the exam. So while you don't necessarily need to memorize these charts specifically, you want to memorize the concept, understand what each of the 3 matrix type models are, as well as the projectized and functional models. And so really this chart here is the more beneficial one to remember. All right, some of the other things that influence our projects. Well, let me, how do I want to do this? I'm trying to think of the best order to explain this. Well, yeah, we'll just tackle these individually. Yeah. There are 2 elements that influence almost every single process throughout our project, all right? So they're pretty important. They're ones that we want to be familiar with, at least conceptually, because they are such a prevalent thing. The first one is called organizational process assets. All right, it's a big name. Let me bring up my notes. Where are my notes? There. So I'm talking about these guys right here. Organizational process assets. All right. When you're managing a project, it's extremely rare that you are starting out with absolutely nothing. Okay. It's very rare for you to have a project that is to start a company. So almost always, your company's already in business, and your project is adding something to that business. In that scenario, your company likely has certain assets that you can use. Now, if it's a brand new company, if your project is to start the company, then you don't have any assets, right? You can go out and get things, but you don't have assets themselves. And by assets, I don't necessarily mean materials. I don't mean like, company car or whatever. What I mean are processes and procedures. You might have rules, specific ways of doing business defined that are already in place when you go to start your project. All right. So for example, I'm about to start a new project. I just got assigned the project management position and I'm about to run it. I might look and see what the other project managers have done. So if they've already done projects, I can just mirror what they already did. They already have processes and procedures in place for how to submit a status update, for how to pay out of our budget, how to report on the budget. All that stuff may be already defined if we have a well-defined project management environment, right? So those assets are going to influence us. I might have one particular chart that I like to use, but when I look and I see the 5 last projects have all used a different type of chart, I might choose to use that other chart just because I know the employees are already used to it and it's what they expect, all right? So we always need to look at what we already have. I always say, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. If somebody's already done the work, then you shouldn't have to do it again unless you can make it better, right? That's process improvement.
Yeah.
We start getting into Six Sigma there, right? Continual process improvement. So that's a dry topic. So anyhow, just keep that in mind. You probably already have certain assets, and processes and procedures are very common. Less common is a knowledge base, right? I love it when you find a company that has these. Odds are people have made mistakes in the past. And the odds are if you knew about those mistakes, you could avoid them better yourself, right? Learn from other people's mistakes. And that's what knowledge bases are all about. At the end of every project, you're supposed to create what's called a lessons learned, right? The information that you learned as part of your project, what went wrong, how you fixed it, and so on. If that becomes part of a company knowledge base, you can search across that. And you can say, you know what? I need to hire, maybe my project's building a house. So I need to hire drywall installers. Let me look at some of these other projects and see who they used. And I can use that to build my list of possible candidates, right? Or, hey, I'm about to order some servers from HP to put up some new web servers. Well, this other project just did the same thing. Let me look at what price they got. Did they already deal with a rep? Can we get volume discounts, right? Sharing that information, looking at information in other projects really can make a big difference.
Yeah, It also saves time, right? Once again, because we're not reinventing the wheel here, we're instead actually taking a look at all of the possibilities here in terms of possible failures or setbacks that other projects have had. And if they do match in line with what we want to do, it may actually give us a head start and, again, a good functional start for us to be able to do those things and not have to worry about them. Yep.
All right. So organizational process assets, those are things that your company may have. All right. You may have these. You may not. You may not have any of this, and you are starting from scratch. All right. The other thing is enterprise environmental factors. All right. Enterprise environmental factors are things that your company has to have. Right. So this isn't something you have a choice on. If you are regulated by the U.S. government, right, there might be certain rules and standards that you have to follow. If your company is voluntarily chosen to become ISO 9000 certified, there's rules you have to follow to maintain that standard, right? You might have certain governance requirements. So, for example, here in the state of Florida, if you're a government organization, we have the Sunshine Law. So all of your records need to be public information. If you do a bid process, all of that needs to be public. You might be private sector, right? But you might be a publicly traded company, in which case all the financial information about your project needs to be shown to your investors, your stockholders, right? Those are things that are part of your enterprise environmental factors. These are requirements that are imposed upon you, and you don't have a choice, right? So you may know a better way to do things, a different way to manage your project, but tough luck. You're ISO 9000 certified, so you've got to have this paperwork in place whether you like it or not, or you can lose your ISO 9000 designation. So that is an enterprise environmental factor. I put governance, standards, those are some pretty black and white ones.
Right.
We do have some gray area things, right? Like risk tolerance. So risk tolerance is your company may or may not be big into taking risk, right? We're in IT, and so almost every IT company takes risks because God only knows what your computer's going to do tomorrow. And so you'll have people that are risk seekers, people that are looking to take risks because they know the bigger the risk, the greater the reward, assuming it pans out. You also have people that are risk averse. These are people who would rather not take a risk if they didn't have to, would maybe settle for lower profits or a slower project because they weren't taking risk. Or hopefully as a project manager, what you are is what's called risk neutral. A risk neutral person, and let me write all these here in the notes. I'll post these with the episode, but because these are the official terms. We'll talk about them again later. But so you have risk seeker, risk neutral, which I spelled wrong. And
no, I think you did it
was
right.
I right?
Yep, you were right.
Let's see my risky spelling. And then you have risk averse. Risk averse. There we go. All right, so those are kind of our three little levels of risk tolerance right there. If you're a risk seeker and somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want to do this project, there's a chance that it could double our sales by next year. And it's a 10% chance that it could double our sales. Well, you might look at that and say, 10%, 1 out of 10 chance, let's do it, right?
Let's jump right down.
Or you might be risk averse and say, what, are you crazy, 10%? That means there's a 9 out of 10 chance this is gonna fail, forget you, we're not gonna do it, right? Or you might be risk neutral and say, all right, well, 1 out of 10 chance that this might work. What happens if it fails? All right, is it going to cost us money? How much money? You start to qualify. You start to evaluate and look at the numbers, and you say, all right, well, it's pretty risky, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, it's only going to cost us this much. Let's go ahead and do it, right? Or, nah, the odds are it's going to fail and it's going to cost us too much. Let's not do it. Being risk neutral is keeping your mind open. Project managers should always be risk neutral. If you're risk averse, you may be passing up opportunities that were
really good,
possibly beneficial for your company. And if you are a risk seeker, you might be taking unnecessary risks that jeopardize your organization. So being the neutral person, and we have that here, right? It's kind of one of our running things. One of the gentlemen here at the company, Tim, he is a risk seeker. I mean, he has big vision ideas, all packed full of risk. And I'm the risk neutral guy that tries to back that down. Let's start to kind of keep that a little more contained. But at the end of the day, if you don't take risks, you're not going to be successful. So you definitely want to make sure you keep that in mind. But that risk tolerance, your company's risk tolerance, your sponsor's risk tolerance, the tolerance of your stakeholders, your shareholders, right? That's really going to impact how your projects are run, all right? If your company is a risk seeker, you might have very aggressive timelines, very aggressive budgets. But if you're risk averse, you might have longer timelines that allow for schedule slip.
Right.
Or you might have bigger budgets that allow for overrunning the budget a little bit. So you might have safety cushions to help ensure your project is successful. So, it just depends on how your company is built, the kind of people that are in it, which one of those you're going to fall under. And then the last one I've got is marketplace conditions. This is one that wreaks havoc on every project, right? I can't tell you the amount of times that I started a project and got quotes on a lot of stuff, telco systems, hardware, whatever. And then when it came purchase time, the prices were different, right? Marketplace conditions are going to change what we can and can't do. If you're a construction company and normally you build 8,000 square foot houses, but the housing market falls and people can't afford that, you might start building 2,000 square foot houses, much smaller because they sell easier. So that's the kind of thing that starts to influence what projects get selected.
Right.
But as far as what project or how projects are carried out, marketplace conditions can affect that too. If I set a budget and I said I'm going to spend X amount on servers, and all of a sudden I find out there's going to be a great big sale on servers, I might not have intended on buying those servers for another month, but now I know if I buy them right now, I can save 20%. I might do that. I might rearrange my project a bit to buy those servers early because I know it's going to save me money and improve the chances of my project finishing under budget. So marketplace conditions can directly influence your project. Can even lead to it being canceled. Right? You're seeing that with the military right now, the U.S. military, where they had that, what was it called, the Joint Strike Fighter, JSF?
Yeah.
Where, this is something ridiculous, like $32 billion per plane to create it. And apparently they were cool with that 10 years ago when they started the program, but now they're like, ooh, that might be a little expensive.
Yeah.
It takes 10 years to figure that out. So now they're canceling the project. They're 10 years in. They put 10 years of work in there. The project wasn't failing. It was, it was moving along as expected, but the marketplace has changed, and now people's perception of 30 some odd billion per plane has been seen for what it is, which is ludicrous, and so the project gets canceled. So that can happen. A project can be terminated because of marketplace conditions.
Yeah.
All right, well, Ronnie, that's a pretty good spot for us to stop and take a break.
Sounds great.
So why don't we stop here? When we get back, we got some real important stuff to talk about because we're going to look at processes. We kind of talked a little bit about processes, so we got some more of that, and the project life cycle we haven't touched on. So good stuff coming up. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So what I'd like to talk about now is the project life cycle, which is really just a complex way of saying what happens while your project runs.
Right.
Projects have a well-defined timeline, which we mentioned earlier, well, I guess in the last episode, that projects are a temporary endeavor. So they have a start and a finish. If they don't have a well-defined start and finish, you're destined for failure. Very difficult to be successful with a project like that. So PMI has what they call the project life cycle, and it kind of shows what happens throughout your project. Basically, you start your project. This is what we call initiation. It's just the beginning. Somebody thinks of an idea. Hey, I want something to happen. All right? And then we start moving into the actual activities of the project. A project charter is written which kicks off the real project. So you'll see this dotted line. This is how many employees you have dedicated to the project and how much money you've spent. It's pretty low in these first two stages. And the reason is you're not actually doing the work yet. You're planning, you're thinking, you're coming up with eventualities. You have your project team, and that's about it. And your project team may even be very small at this stage, right? So this is all just getting ready. And then once you're done planning, now the real work happens, right? Carrying out the work, getting things done. This is where you spend your budget. You'll see you go up to your maximum employee amount, you start spending, as you buy materials, you bring in contractors, work is getting done. And when the work is done, then we go into closing. We release the employees to work in other projects. We're done with them. We release our contractors who will fulfill their contract, and we go right back down to just being the project team and shutting down, right? The project is only over when the last employee is released, and the last employee is the project manager, right? So the captain goes down with the ship, right? So this is basically what happens throughout the life of a project. They call it the project life cycle, all right? Now, it's pretty common sense.
Right.
Why do we need to be aware of this? The main reason we need to know is how change can affect our project. I made a comment in the first segment. I said how change can get very expensive as time goes on. Well, it's not just change, it's really risk. Risks, things that can go wrong in the project, anything like that becomes more expensive down the road. They actually have a chart for that in here somewhere. Here we go. So notice that at the very beginning of our project, we might have a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty. We just don't know how things are going to go at the beginning of our project. But as we near the end of our project, our risk goes down and our uncertainty, we know a lot more. We know we're almost to the finish line, so it's a lot less risky and a lot less uncertain. But if we want to change, notice this cost of change, it steadily increases so that making changes at the last minute can be incredibly expensive, right? I equate this to like a college degree, right? So if you're pursuing a 4-year degree, and in your first year, right, maybe you're wanting to do, well, you take me as an example, right? So I did political science. And in my first year of college, if I had decided, hey, I don't want to do political science, I want to switch to computer sciences, computer information sciences. Well, if I made that change in my first year, it's not a big deal. I only had one semester, maybe 2 semesters under my belt, not a lot of classes. Most of those were gen ed stuff anyway. So no big deal, change majors, great. But that's not what I did. I changed majors in my 4th year. I was basically done with my degree when I decided I wanted to switch. Well, that's a big deal. I had a ton of credits that I already done in one degree, and now I switched and ended up just finishing both because it kind of made sense. But it was an expensive change. I had to take a lot more courses. That's how your project is. If you decide to change the timeline, if you decide to change the budget, which is next to impossible, if you decide to change the requirements, to add more requirements at the end of the project, in order to get those new requirements done and still meet your timeline, it's going to cost money. You're going to need to bring in more people. It's very dangerous to do that kind of a change at the end of a project. All right. So we need to understand that because the cost of change increases, the likelihood of change decreases. So normally as you reach the end of your project, you're going to see less changes happening. You might see a lot of change right here while we're planning. As we learn more, we recognize more, we modify and adapt to meet our requirements, right? We improvise, adapt, overcome, right? The Marine Corps motto, or unofficial one, I guess. And then when we actually go to carry out the work, we've got people doing stuff. If we've already laid the foundation for the house, and then the buyer comes and says, you know what, I want to add one more room. You're like, well, crud, we've already poured the foundation. Now we got to extend the foundation out. It can be done, but there's already walls here. We got to take those out, right? The further along that house is in its build, the harder it becomes to add on to it. But if we think of it early on, before the foundation's laid, it's a marginal thing to add, right? That's how change is with our project. So we need to be aware of where we're at in the life cycle. Here in the planning phase, change is okay. Don't be resistant. Allow change to occur. Make sure that it still conforms to what you set out in the original. We'll talk about the project charter later on. But meets that kind of stuff, and that we don't deviate too far from our original goals. But it's okay to make change here. It's also okay to make minor change when you're executing. Major change is possible too. It's not impossible. We just need to make sure we understand what it's going to cost us. And usually that cost is represented one of 3 ways. And I don't really, let's see if I can do my silly drawing here real quick. Projects are made up of a number of requirements, and they really rotate around 3 concepts. So let me show you what I mean. Let me get a nice big triangle here. And when we do project management, we're really balancing 3 different ideas. we start off with, for example, budget. And let me just make this legible. There we go. So we got budget, schedule, and there we go, and requirements. All right, so at the beginning of a project, somebody comes up with these three things, and that somebody is who knows who. It could be the project sponsor, it could be the PMO, it's whoever it is that defines projects for your organization, right? And when we complete the project, these are the three things that we're competing against. We need to meet a certain schedule. If I need to be done by December 1st, all right? Everything I need that I do has to be built around that date. I've got to be done by December 1st. If my budget is $500,000, I can't spend any more than $500,000. I need to figure that out. And then requirements. Here's what I need to achieve. Here's the checklist of what I've got to do. If I don't do any of this stuff, my project fails. If a change comes in and somebody wants to add more requirements, what's that going to do? Well, it may take more time. I need to add more to my schedule, right? More time. Or if I can't add more time, if December 1st is still my date, but they're adding more requirements, I may need to add more staff. Yeah, that's going to increase my budget, right? I'm going to need to spend more money, all right? But if they add requirements, but don't add time to the schedule and don't add budget, can we do it?
No.
Maybe, but that's a lot of risk right there, right? So this is the kind of change that we don't want to allow. We're constantly playing a balancing game between these three things right here. Now, the terminology that I've used here is our standard terminology, but you'll hear other terms thrown around for this, like instead of schedule, you may hear it referred to as time. And budget, you might hear referred to as cost, and requirements, you might hear referred to as scope. We haven't talked about scope yet. So you may hear different terminology. So let me just update this to reflect both terms. So so this would be like requirements / scope, and schedule / time, and budget. I can type, please. There we go, cost. And so these are the three things that we're competing against with a project. I used to use a car mechanic that had this sign above his little mechanic's bay, and the sign basically said something that really kind of ties into this same idea. Let me write it over here. It basically said, we do three types of jobs here. We do good, fast, and cheap, right? He said we do three jobs. You can pick two, all right? So if you want your car fixed and you want it to be good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. If you want it to be fast and cheap, it's not going to be good. And if you want it to be good and cheap, it's not going to be fast, right? You got to pick two of the three. Well, that's how project management is. Right. When you want your project done, if you want it to be done fast on a low budget, then you're not going to be able to pick a lot of requirements. Right. It's going to have to be a simple project. But if you want a complex project with a lot of requirements and you want it done fast, you're going to need a big budget, right? This is what we're doing. We're juggling between these different elements in our project as we try and plan things, we try and get things in place. So this is a constant balancing game. And when you look at that project life cycle back here, change way down here, adding new requirements or whatever, that's going to affect your schedule and budget. You've got to balance and plan around that. All right. So that's basically the project life cycle and what we're involved in. Now, notice how they've kind of broken parts of this down. We have the project charter, project management plan, accepted deliverables. What is all that stuff? Well, these are components or artifacts of the project. And that term artifact, I immediately think Indiana Jones, right, grabbing a golden monkey head off of an altar. The artifacts they're talking about, though, is really just paperwork, right? So these are documents that define our project. or well, accepted deliverables. That may be a document you signed off on it, but there's the deliverable itself, whatever that is. So these are all things that are being created as part of our project. How do we know to create those things? Well, PMI has a well-defined set of phases that we follow as we move through a project and various activities that we perform as a part of those. And that is a part of our project management lifecycle. So they don't really show all 5 phases here. They show kind of like 4 divisions because they've kind of combined 2 phases right here. And that goes back to something I mentioned in the last episode also, which, let's see, where did I talk about that? Here. So these are the 5 phases that I talked about in part 1. Initiation, we come up with the idea of a project. Planning, we figure out how we're going to do it. Execution, we do it. Monitoring and controlling, we watch how it's being done, we make sure we stay on target. If we aren't, we correct, and then we close. And I made the comment that execution and monitoring really happen at the same time, right? And that's why when we look at the project life cycle here, they only show 4, and that's because here, executing, monitoring, and controlling are all happening right here during carry out the work, all right? So this is actually showing all 5 of those phases just kind of more accurately.
Yeah. A lot of times the terminology changes as well, because when we start talking to people that are not in the project management field, to tell them that we're in the process of executing or monitoring and controlling may not actually have a good understanding for them, or the idea of initiating, or the idea of planning out. So what this gives us is the ability to take all those things that we've worked very hard in, and then when we deliver it to our stakeholders who may not be as familiar, we can walk them through the life cycle, and in that way they have a better understanding of it. Stakeholders are actually better informed, and that makes them actually feel better about what's actually coming up. Yeah.
And we want them to feel better, don't we?
We do. We want them to feel better, because if not, they could be, well, again, not so good for this.
All right, so in the project management, in the Project Management Institute's framework, they divide up everything we need to do by these phases. So there's certain things we need to do in the initiation phase. Let me go back to my diagram. In the initiation phase, there's certain things we need to do in the planning phase. And then there's different things for each phase along the way. And there's a whole list of them, just a giant laundry list, all right? So what they do is they divide up the things we need to do into what are called processes. And there are a ton of processes. I had to look at my cheat sheet.
47.
There are 47 processes. Now, you might ask yourself, wait a minute, Don, you're a PMP, you've been one for a long time. Why do you have to look at your cheat sheet? The reason is PMI, they update the project management body of knowledge, the PMBOK. When I originally got my PMP, it was the PMBOK 3rd edition, all right? They had just moved to the 3rd edition when I got certified. Well, since I've been with the PMI, which that was 6 years ago, so since then, the PMBOK 4th edition came out, and then the 5th edition came out. And with each edition, they eliminate some processes that people aren't using, and they introduce new processes that can be beneficial to people. And sometimes they combine processes, and they split processes apart. So it changes, right? So when I first got certified, there were 42, and that's what I memorized, 42. Easy to remember the meaning of life from the Douglas Adams books. So 42, but it's changed. And so now there's 47. Some have been added, some have been removed, some have been merged, some have been split, all right? So there's 47 of them. Do I have them memorized? Absolutely not. There's a ton of them. As a project manager, we need to be familiar with all of them as far as what they do. You don't have to memorize every single one of them. But there's 47 different activities that you may or may not need to take depending on your organization. As a project manager, it's up to you to figure that out. Look at all 47 of them and say, do I need this or not? All right. For example, accounting. There's like 4 different, actually I think there's more than 4. I can tell you, let me give an actual number. So if you're a money person, there are, oh, that's right, there's 4. There's 4 different accounting processes that you might fall under, right? But in your company might have a policy that says project managers are not allowed to do accounting, that their budget is managed by the accounting department, and they can request funds, request payouts, but the project managers aren't allowed to sign checks. So you have to do it all through accounting. Well, in that case, you look at those 4 processes and you say, you know what? I don't need those because we don't do that. We let the accounting department handle it. So you had 47 processes. Now you just have 43, right? And you may find as you look over all the processes that there's many like that your company just doesn't need, all right? But there's some core ones. There's a good 25 or so core ones that everybody needs.
Right.
That's the glory of this being a framework, is that you customize it to meet your needs. You pick the parts that are good for you, and you leave the parts that you don't need for your organization, right? So definitely have that flexibility. All right, so because there's so many processes, what the PMI does is they divide it up into what are called knowledge areas. So let me see. This is in the, I'll just pull it up in the PMBOK because it makes the most sense there. They have a cool chart on page 61. There it is. This chart right here, where they lay out the phases so I can see initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing, right? Those are the 5 phases. Now, here they're labeled as process groups because they're collecting these processes together. So here's all the initiating processes, here's all the planning processes, and so on. Then they subdivide that into what are called knowledge areas. And a knowledge area is really based on who the employee is, what their job function is. And by employee, I mean the project team member. So, for example, if you are the project manager, you need to know all these, right? But if you're the accountant, then you come down here to find that knowledge area right here, project cost management, all right? The accountant deals with project cost. And so here's the processes that apply to the accountants, right? They've got plan cost management, estimate cost, determine budget, control costs. Those are the 4 things that the accountants are going to work on, all right? If you are the scheduling coordinator, then you are concerned about project time management. And you'll see that you've got a bunch of stuff right here: plan schedule management, define activities, sequence activities, estimate resources. These are things that a scheduler will deal with, and then control the schedule, right? Notice how project time management has absolutely nothing in the initiating phase, and they have nothing in the closing phase. That means that during those phases, I don't necessarily need my project scheduler, all right? So when we go back to that project life cycle, page is that 39?
Yes.
Yeah. When we go back here, remember how it said cost staffing level, and see how there's not a lot of staff here at initiating? It's because somebody like a scheduler, I don't need them until I get to planning. And then I don't need them when I'm closing anymore because the project's over. So these are employees that you add and remove at certain phases of the project. So understanding where we need those people, that kind of comes down to this table right here. This is a very important table. This is like a guidebook to everything you need to know for the exam. These processes are what makes up the PMI framework, and it's what you're being tested on, is knowing how to use each of these different processes. All right, so when we look down the knowledge area list here, we're seeing basically job roles, right? Project integration management. That is the project manager tying the project in with the company's goals and making the project work the way that it's supposed to work. So developing a charter, developing a plan, direct and manage the project work, right? This is stuff that the project manager does. Project scope management, that's managing the requirements of the project, what we need to do to consider this complete. The project manager does this along with the sponsor and the other stakeholders, right? The various people who have influence on this are going to be dealing with the project scope. And we're going to do shows on each and every one of these. So you'll see that we've got a lot more, we'll go a lot more in depth on these later. Project time management, that's schedule, right? So who's managing that schedule? You might have a scheduling coordinator, or you might do it yourself as the project manager. Same thing with cost management. You might have an accountant that's doing the cost management, or you might do it yourself. Project quality management. For a lot of organizations, it's the project manager doing this. Quality just means, am I meeting my requirements? I'm doing the work. Is it meeting the requirements? If it isn't, I'm below quality. I need to fix that, right? In a manufacturing environment, this might be, if we're producing something, does it meet the requirements or does it have flaws, right? Do we need to reevaluate our processes? Project human resource management. This is adding employees to the project, taking employees away when you're done with them. This might be done by the PMO. It might be done by you as the project manager in a projectized environment. But in a functional organization, this is going to be the functional managers that do it. So this may be assigned again to somebody else. But we plan that resource management when we're going to need those people, and then acquire, develop, and manage the team. Project communications management. This is steered by the project manager, but might be carried out by marketing people if you have them, or communications personnel. These are how we communicate information about the project as it's ongoing. We don't need that in initiating and closing, but we need it throughout the active phases of the project. Project risk management. If you've ever worked for an insurance company, then you've dealt with risk. At an insurance company, you can't throw a pencil down a hall without hitting somebody with a master's degree in risk management. So, very common there. But in any high dollar project, you're going to have a risk manager. In a low dollar project, you may be the risk manager. You got to evaluate what risks your project is exposed to and how you handle them. So that's what you see here. Plan for risk management, identify risks, do the analysis, plan risk responses. These are all activities centered around that idea of managing risk. All right. Project procurement management. This is one that was added in the PMBOK 4th edition. This used to not exist. That this used to be grouped under the costs, right? By procurement, we mean getting things, getting materials. And it centers around spending money. So that used to fall under cost. They split it out though, because now the procurement management includes contracts. So if you have negotiators or contract managers, these are the people who are handling that. Drafting the contract, putting them out for bid, getting responses, signing off on the contracts. So if you have had previous exposure to the PMBOK, then this might be a change that you have to get used to. If you're all new though, this is great. It's its own little thing, and it kind of sets separate here. Same thing with stakeholder management. That used to be a part of the communications. Now it's its own separate entity. So identifying stakeholders and so on. This is something the project manager will typically do, but you might have somebody separate that does that, like the PMO that might identify that. So these are the knowledge areas, and notice how they're numbered. See how it starts at 4? You might say, well, where's 1, 2, and 3? Well, they're actually numbered based on the section of the PMBOK that covers them, not so much just their entity itself. So there's actually 10 of them, and each one is just identifying a different knowledge area inside of our project and kind of what they do. So it's important. It helps us to kind of break things down, because otherwise it's an overwhelming amount of processes. And these numbers that you see, like 6.1, 6.5, if I want to learn more about controlling the schedule, I go in the PMBOK to 6.7, section 6, subparagraph 7, or whatever it is, section 7, and you'll find it, and that's where it'll teach you how to control the schedule. So use this as a guide. We're going to use it all throughout the show. So during the show, when we start a new section, we'll bring this chart back up and say, all right, we're about to tackle 5.1. We're in the planning phase. This falls under scope management as far as our knowledge area. So you'll see a lot of that. But just be aware there's a lot of them, right? 47 processes altogether, 5 process groups, which are, our phases in the project, all right? And then 10 knowledge areas, which are kind of like that job role. Yep. So very important stuff. So you'll see that when I study, or even right here in the show, I always keep this handy. I've got a printout, right? This kind of thing, go ahead and print one out right now. It's super handy for measuring your studies, seeing where you need to focus on, keeping things straight. It fits on a page. It's a little small, but as I get older, it becomes harder to read. But definitely something good to have, useful thing to keep this straight. So, all right. So really, when we start tackling the exam and how we manage the project, it's these 47 processes. Now, throughout the show, we're going to show you how each and every process works, how you're supposed to use them, and then it's up to you to figure out which ones you need and which ones you don't. So this is a pretty good spot for us to stop and take a break. And what I'd like to do is come back for one more segment, and I want to show you guys an example of a process, what makes up a process, how they work, and then in our later shows, we'll actually start to tackle the true processes. All right. Ronnie, anything else to add before we break?
Nope, that's a lot of material.
Yeah, it definitely adds up. All right, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We'll be back in a few. All right, welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were talking about the 47 different processes that make up the PMI framework. I feel like it's Baskin and Robbins, right? 47 different flavors of terrible yogurt. So, so anyhow, we have all these processes, and it can be a lot. It can be overwhelming to look at it. But at the end of the day, it's really not that bad because most of the processes follow a very similar pattern. All right, PMI tries to make it as easy as possible. So let me show you an example. So I pulled up here, develop a project management plan. This is one of the first processes that we run. And you'll see that it's made up of 3 pieces: an input, a set of tools and techniques, and an output. Basically, we have certain data that we feed into the process, something we should already have, right? And then we have tools and techniques that we apply to that data that then creates a certain output. And all 47 processes follow that same model. So I just kind of made it a little more generic here, right? So under inputs, you'll have a series of different inputs, and they change depending on what the process is. If this is the very, very first process that we deal with, right, to develop a project charter, there's not really much of an input to have, right? We don't have a lot of documents. But some of the inputs aren't documents per se, but are other elements. And so remember how we talked about organizational process assets and enterprise environmental factors, right? Let me go back to my notes. Those were 2 things that we talked about as things that could influence our project, right? These guys right here. Well, those serve as inputs to almost every single process. Not everyone, but almost everyone. Every process needs to be put in the context of your company. The organizational process assets that your company has, your way of doing things, and then your enterprise environmental factors, the requirements of your business. If you're a medical organization dealing with medical records, you have to follow HIPAA compliance or something like that. Those are going to influence how you handle that process. So you will see those 2 as inputs to almost every single process. You'll see it very frequently, all right? So there's usually only a couple of unique inputs, and then you'll have really unique tools and techniques, right? Different tools and techniques you use to create the output that you're looking for. So if I have a process like develop a project charter, right? My inputs are going to be things that I need to build a project charter, right? Develop a project charter process, that's to create a project charter. So what's my output going to be? The project charter. It just makes sense, all right? I want to create a project charter. Now, what is a project charter? Well, we're going to talk about it in the next episode, but just to sum it up briefly, it is what defines the basic idea of your project, what you're going to be doing. But most importantly, it's where your sponsor signs off giving authority to the project manager. So this is where a project manager gets their authority. This is the single most important document in your entire project, right? So I want to create that document. Well, if I want to create the document, what do I need? I need a couple of things. I need a statement of work. I need a business case justifying the project. I need any agreements that have been made between my company and other companies as a part of this project. Those are things that I need because they're going to become part of the charter. And then I need my enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets, these things that influence my project. I take all of that as information, and then I apply 2 things, all right? Number 1, expert judgment. Expert judgment is your brain. Use your brain, use your common sense, use what you know as a project manager. I need to take all of these and write them up in a document. So I need to know grammar. I need to know basic writing skills. Those are things that fall under expert judgment, all right? I also need facilitation techniques. I need to facilitate the needs of all of these things. I need to combine them in a way where all of my requirements are satisfied, right? Where I meet my legal requirements under enterprise environmental factors, I use the tools provided by the company under organizational process assets, I incorporate a business case that shows this project is worthwhile. I put all of that stuff together, and I might have to negotiate a little bit or whatever to facilitate getting all of those working hand in hand. And when they're done, I create a document that's called a project charter that lists exactly what my project is going to be doing at a high level at this stage, because we haven't done planning yet. and I get my sponsor to sign off on it, right? So the process is really telling us how to create a project charter, right? I can't create a project charter without these things, and then here's what I do to them to create that final charter. This is how every process is mapped out. So all 47 of them have a diagram just like this, and they're easy to spot in the PMBOK because this is what they look like. So you will always have a set of inputs, you'll have a set of tools and techniques you use with the data from the inputs, and then your outputs. Typically, you'll only have one output. Sometimes you have more than one. It just depends on which process it is. But the output that you get, like this project management plan, will then serve as an input for other processes. So here, project management plan, if I just skim ahead and try and find the next one, here, see how project management plan is an input for the direct and managed project work process, right? So you'll see that very commonly where one output becomes the input for another process, and that means that you can't move forward until you've finished this. You know, some of them fall chronologically. I tried to map them out once. Have you ever tried this,
No.
Ronnie? There's 47 of the things. So if you try and map them out, it's a spaghetti mess really fast, right? Because they're so intertwined. So we don't normally look at them that way. More commonly, we look at them in terms of that chart that I brought up earlier here, where we say, I can't really validate and control my scope unless I've already created it, right? So these scope activities right here, these processes have to complete before these processes can kick off. You know, it kind of makes sense where they fall in the life cycle of the project. Yeah. So just be aware, while it does look a bit overwhelming here with all of these different processes and every one of them having different requirements, that at the end of the day, it really does break down to something simple. You've got various inputs, which almost always include organizational process assets and enterprise environmental factors. You'll see those over and over again. You have tools and techniques, which almost always includes expert judgment. Use your head, right? As well as other elements that we'll see. And then the output typically matches whatever the name of the process is. So if the process is telling me to develop a stakeholder matrix, then that's going to be my output is a stakeholder matrix. And so that, you know, kind of makes things a little bit easier to deal with. All right, so that's kind of a preview for what the processes are. Every show following this, all the other shows that we're going to do are going to center around these processes. So we'll take a process and we'll talk about what all the inputs are. So we have to understand those. And then the tools and techniques we're going to use with the data that we're inputting, and then how to create that final product. And each one kind of leading up to some way of managing and moving the project forward. The only part that really deviates is when we get into execution, because there we're doing a lot of monitoring, and so our inputs are going to be status updates, and our outputs will oftentimes be more status updates. And so, so there'll be status updates with the possibility of change tickets. If we've deviated from where we're supposed to be, if we're behind schedule or whatever, we'll have change tickets that are us trying to correct to control the environment, put it back on schedule. Right? So we'll see all that stuff as we go through the later episodes, but at a simple level, this is it. It's pretty cool, you know, it really does work well.
Yeah.
All right, well, Ronnie, that's probably it for this episode. You know, we just wanted to kind of cover the basics.
Right.
We're ready to move into the specific stuff, but we don't have enough time left in this episode. So why don't we wrap it up here?
Okay.
I do want to remind everybody, if you have any questions on this stuff, keep in mind that live during the show, you can go to itpro.tv/live. You'll see our video screen, and the chat is right beneath it. You can post your questions there. We monitor and answer during the show. If you have questions after the show, if we're running reruns or whatever, use the Q&A forums. You'll see a link that says Q&A at the top of every page. Click on it. It'll take you into the forums. You can post your questions there. We monitor and answer and make sure that you get the information you need so that you're ready for that exam. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Don Pizzette.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we will see you next time.